welcome to another Scots Whay Hae podcast. And today I'm joined by journalist, critic, and presenter Fergus Morgan to talk about the excellent podcast, A History of Scottish Drama in 6 Plays, which you can get in all the usual podcast places. Hello, Fergus.
Hello, Alistair. How are you doing?
I'm really well, thanks. And I'm really enjoying the podcast. I'm lucky enough to have seen productions of 5 of your 6 choices. So
That's more than me. That's more than I have, Alistair.
First of all, why did you want to examine the history of Scottish drama?
Well, there were a number of reasons. There were kind of personal, professional reasons in that I've worked as a kind of written journalist for a decade now, and I wanted to. Written arts journalism is dying on its arse in kind of traditional print media, and although I'm trying to diversify. I'm in numerous directions. I have a Substack that's doing fairly well, thankfully, and I also wanted to diversify into making audio work. I was also conscious that I've been living in Scotland and writing about theatre for 6 to 5 years now. I've been the Stage of Scotland correspondent for about 3.5, I think. I can't really remember. But I didn't really know my stuff, to be honest. So I thought if I could do something that ticked both of those boxes, that allowed me to diversify as a journalist and learn more skills, and also learn about the history of Scottish drama and kind of clue up about that, then I would. I also thought there was another element to it, beyond the kind of personal professional thing, which is I wanted to make something useful. Scottish theatre is not in a great place at the moment, economically, I would say, perhaps creatively as well, as a result of that, maybe, and it needs to think about where it wants to go and what it wants to do. And I think there is a kind of paucity, a dearth, a lack of knowledge about the history of Scottish theatre in general, even within the industry. I think there's only a real handful of people that know this stuff. And I think that's bad, and I think that's a problem, because I think it's only when you know where you've been that you can figure out where you're going, basically. So I thought that if in whatever modest way I could help Scottish theatre have the conversations that it needs to have about the state that it's in, about the things that it has achieved, and I think the things that it can achieve, and as exampled in the podcast in the past, I thought that would be a worthwhile thing to do.
And what I like so much is that although you've picked 6 plays to kind of base each episode around, you contextualize around them. It really is educational.
Thank you for saying that. That was my most. I mean, that's something that I'm driven by in all my work, is that I hate criticism, or I hate journalism even, that is exclusionary, that feels like, or a history that feels exclusionary, that you feel like you need to have a knowledge to enter. You feel like you have to have a special key, you have to have studied it, you have to have been part of the industry to understand it. That really annoys me. But I also hate things that dumb things down. So what I tried to do, and well, maybe you agree, hopefully you do, is talk about it in detail and in and hopefully with expertise and insight, and go into a lot of depth, but also a lot of context, so that anyone who doesn't know anything about Scottish theatre, like pretty much like I did 5 years ago, they don't feel like they need. I hold their hand throughout it, I suppose. They don't feel like they're totally out of the depth.
Yeah. Because I'd often wondered why you had this, which was the first choice in Satire of the Three Estates, and then hardly anything really, it seemed to me, that was known, known about until you get into the kind of 20th century. Before we go into the individual plays, why did you pick these plays? Was that a difficult choice?
Well, it was. It could have been a history of Scottish drama in 20 plays and 50 plays in anything. But well, I was guided by several things. Sometimes it was practicality, in that I wanted on each episode, apart from episode 4, I should say, I wanted to find recordings of the plays so that I could use clips from them. Because I think that, it's a theatre podcast. If you're just listening to me wanging on the whole time, like you are right now, that probably gets quite dull.
Let's
So I
hope.
wanted to illustrate I was also, but so I wanted, and those were the plays that I could find recordings of.
Yeah.
I was also wanting to pick not necessarily the most famous plays, although I did end up picking some of the most famous plays in Scottish drama, but also sometimes the most illustrative plays of an era. So the plays that I thought, and having spoken to people who know a lot more than me, also thought captured the zeitgeist of an era, or the economic thrust of an era, or the boundary breaking energy of an era within those plays. So that's how I sort of ended up politically. Some of them were obvious.
Yeah. And I would say in satire's probably one which I'm guessing was fairly obvious.
Yeah, that was the first thing I wrote down that I would do a play on. After that, I think probably you'd have had to go for Men Should Weep or the Gorbals story, maybe in the 1940s, to kind of symbolize Glasgow Unity Theatre. The Cheviot, the Stag and the Black Black Oil, well, maybe we'll get onto this, I don't know, is an interesting choice because you could have picked an actual, that's less of a traditional play. But then the other thing I wanted to illustrate, and this is one of the reasons I chose Blackwatch for episode 6 as well, is this strand in Scottish drama that is written, but not theatrically, is not as text-based as maybe some kind of traditional plays.
And I think we will touch on each one of them and see, kind of what makes them kind of stand out. But let's start with in Satire of the Three Estates. For people that don't know, it kind of what are the Three Estates? Let people know.
Oh God, I don't know. What is it? It's the bishops, like the church, the burgesses, which I interpreted as like the merchants and stuff. I think, isn't it? And then what's the last one? The nobility, the kind of. So these are like the powers that be in 16th century Scotland, I suppose, that make up the body of the Scottish state.
Yeah.
And the idea being that they're all kind of corrupt in their own way, and they're all exploitative, and they're all in need of reform, which of course arrived.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you've got the common man coming in, the common wheel, I think they call him.
Right, John Commonweal, this kind of every man figure.
Yeah, I saw, I think it was St. Stephen's Church in Edinburgh when I was an undergraduate university. A crowd of us went down there, and it was just brilliant.
So this would have been in the well, I hope I'm not offending you. This was in the 80s, right, Alistair?
This would have been no, because I didn't go to university until late. I was late going to university. I was in my late 20s, so it would have been the 90s, I think.
Interesting. I wonder which production that was, because there was a Scottish theatre company production in the mid 1980s that toured for quite a long time and was quite successful. And it was quite extravagant. It went all over Europe, I think.
I can't remember. I may have the wrong church as well. I don't know it, but it was definitely in a church.
Did you enjoy it?
I did. I thought it was great. Yeah, it was. Now the original was really long. Is that right? I think.
Yeah, it's been done in full in Linlithgow in 2013, I think, and it was about 7 hours long. It's basically, for anyone that doesn't know, I'm conscious, like I was saying earlier, I'm conscious that you might not know what it is, listener. And it's essentially the story of a king called Rex Humanitas who is led astray by vice, and these vices are kind of personified in the play as characters, and then is brought back around. This is the kind of first half of the play, by personifications of virtue, and then at the end of the first half he calls a parliament, and in the second half they have this kind of really extraordinary scenes depicting the procession of Parliament and the kind of reforming of these three estates that we're talking about, who have been exploiting the common man for so long, and have made Scotland a very difficult place to be for if you're not rich and influential. That's the broad story of the play, anyway.
Yeah, and what's interesting is it does keep coming around again. People put it on now, maybe partly for historical reasons, but still there's a relevance there which people obviously tap into.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, this stuff is still, I mean, without getting too political, I think we're living in the world run by billionaires and corrupt. I mean, I think the church is less of an issue perhaps today. We're a bit more secular in society, but I mean, not in America. You know what I mean? There's still so. Yeah, it's eternally relevant. That's one of the great things about it.
So I reckon, going back to seeing it in Edinburgh, it was probably about 3 hours long, and I did enjoy it. Yeah, it was, and it was kind of, you know, this wasn't a grand production. It was them coming dipping in and out the pews and things like that, which I guess is close to what it must have been like back in the day.
Yeah, it was performed in Linlithgow Palace as an interlude, I think, in 1542, and that would have been a kind of a fun little thing for the king to watch, basically, James V. And then it was subsequently performed in Cooper and then in Edinburgh, and they would have been in full. That was the full play, David Lindsay's full play, and that would have been a much more bigger affair, performed on these kind of wooden platforms set up. I don't know what it was in Cooper, but I know in Edinburgh it was on the green side, which would have been where the kind of playhouse is today, on the north side of Colton Hill, I think. And that would have been a much bigger affair because obviously the city wasn't there then. That was all green space, and everyone would have come trooping down from the city around the mound to watch this 7-hour play. And God knows if they were watching it or not. They were probably getting pissed half the time, but I'm sure it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, well, it has got it is entertaining as theatre, should we, as well as there's a lot of something that runs through a lot of the plays is the kind of radical nature of them as well, the kind of challenging nature of them. There's quite a jump up to Ina Lamont Stewart's Men Should Weep, 1947. Now, is that because you've only got 6 to pick, and that's the thing, or did Scottish drama kind of atrophy during that period?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's an interesting, and it is a kind of much debated point. Yes, it did, to an extent, and people lay the blame for that at the door of the kind of reformed Scottish Church, so from the late 16th century right throughout the 17th century, there was very little theatrical activity because the reformed Scottish Church just wasn't keen on it one bit. Didn't want people to have much fun, and certainly didn't want people to go to the theatre. But also, you get in 1603 the Union of the Crowns. James VI inherits the throne of England from his cousin Elizabeth I and becomes King of England as well. Leaves Edinburgh and promises to return, but only ever comes back once. And Scotland is left without a royal court, and that means that it's left without the protection. It's left without the patronage of kind of formal drama. It's left without the patronage of the arts. And the whole surroundings of the court that would have sustained that kind of culture, but it also means that it's left without a protector from the kind of stern strictures of the Protestant Church, and as a result, formal Scottish drama kind of withers and dies, at least until the kind of mid 18th century, pretty much, apart from a kind of small renaissance after the restoration of the monarchy in the late 17th century, when I think the Duke of York or something like Charles II's younger brother comes to stay in Edinburgh for a few years. But that said, that's not to say that there wasn't theatrical activity going on, because obviously the church could only reach so far, and there's a lot of records of the church trying to suppress folk festivities and Cayleys and May games and all this kind of thing in rural Scotland, and those records wouldn't exist if this stuff wasn't going on. Sure. So there were theatrical activity happening. It just wasn't written down and happening in theatres. Then what happens is that slowly people, particularly in Edinburgh, kind of fight to re-establish a theatre, and as the power of the church wanes, and Scotland becomes more industrialized, and towns grow and kind of grow bigger. Throughout that process, theatre starts popping up again. I think Edinburgh gets the first. There was also the patent, the Licensing Act of 1743 which means you get this distinction between kind of legitimate licensed playhouses and illegitimate playhouses, which has a big effect for a while. But broadly, this is going again. Listen to the podcast if you want more detail.
This is all on the podcast in great detail, but it is fascinating. It's a fascinating history.
And then basically by the 19th century, theatre's back, but it's basically Walter Scott adaptations for a century before amateur drama takes over in the early 20th century, and we arrive eventually at Glasgow Unity Theatre.
Yeah, it's so interesting. It's rarely you get a history of an absence of something, which is what it is, which I think
Yeah,
is so interesting.
there's a lot of kind of what are they, counterfactuals I
Mhm.
think about as well. These kind of what ifs of
Yeah,
history. So what if Elizabeth I had a son and James VI had never inherited the throne of England and Scotland had maintained the royal court? What if the Reformation hadn't been so strong? There's all sorts of what ifs, and it's just quite fun to think about, I suppose. It's also quite depressing sometimes because you think England's got Shakespeare, London's got Shakespeare. The second half of Shakespeare's career is basically sponsored by James VI.
yeah,
So if James VI had never left, why does Scotland not have a Shakespeare?
absolutely.
Because James VI moved from Scotland to London.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So let's move on to Men Should Weep. We're now in 1947. This has just struck me. I was talking yesterday to the writer Alan Taylor about his book or Edinburgh, an autobiography, and I think that's when the Edinburgh Festival starts as well. Is it 47?
Yep, that's the same year.
Yeah.
Different kind of. So that's interesting because what happens there is there's two. Not it's wrong to think of them in entirely opposition to each other, but there's two twin strands of kind of theatrical dramatic culture, both of which grew out of amateur dramatic movement, which kind of was popular in Scotland throughout the first half of the 20th century. One of which was white, middle class, and bourgeois, and well-to-do, which is very much associated with the playwright James Bridie, who founded the Citizens in Glasgow and was a big part of founding the Edinburgh Festival as well. But then the other one is Glasgow Unity Theatre, which was much more left-wing. It had much more international socialist connections, and it was very much connected to the labour movement. And these two twin strands of drama were often a little bit snitty with each other. And the Edinburgh Festival excluded Glasgow Unity Theatre. They wanted to be part of the first Edinburgh Festival, but they weren't invited to be. And so they came in anyway and did a production of The Lower Depths by Maxim Gorky, and in doing so, they founded the Edinburgh Fringe. So that's kind of the story of the early 20th century of Scottish drama, with these twin strands that are sort of thing. And it's interesting that 1947 is when they both kind of come to a head.
Yeah, absolutely. And for people who don't know Men Should Weep, could you give a brief description of it?
It's a really miserable play. No, it's this kind of masterpiece, really, of social realism set in Glasgow tenement in the 1930s. It focuses on the Morrison family, who are very poor and who kind of terrible things happen to. And that's basically the play. At the heart of it is this really remarkable female role of Maggie Morrison, who is kind of an iconic part in Scottish drama. Who kind of it's interesting. There's two versions. The first version is really, really bleak. Everybody dies or goes into the workhouse or something like that. And then Ina Lamont Stewart rewrote it for a revival that happened in 1982 in a famous season called Clydeville at the Glasgow Citizens, when it was a lot cheerier. I mean, it's still pretty miserable, but nobody dies, and it ends on a slight note of hope.
Hope, that's right. That's the version I've seen, definitely. And again, something which seems relevant today. In fact, in recent years, perhaps more relevant than at any other time since.
Yeah, I mean, it's about people. There's an extraordinary speech in it. It's about people having to live with poverty and the choices that they have to make, and the dilemmas that puts on their life. And there's an extraordinary speech by John Morrison, I think that's his name, the husband character, where he says all we did wrong was to be born into poverty. It's not our fault, and yet just this tidal wave of shit happens.
Yeah,
Which it's as relevant today as ever, I would say.
it's an incredibly powerful piece.
Mm.
And then we move on to the Cheviot, the Stag, and the Blackback Oil. I mean, I said I've seen 5 of them. I've seen this on video. I haven't seen it live.
Have you seen the BBC, the TV version of it? Yeah,
Yeah, because I had a
still on YouTube.
very forward-thinking English teacher at school who showed us the video of it, and it stuck. I think it was the first Panto aside, it was the first piece of Scottish theatre I'd ever come across, and it just really blew me away.
Yeah, I just it's tremendous. You can still watch that on YouTube today, and I would encourage anyone to, because it's remarkable that that exists, that filming of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and it not just, so the Cheviot, the Stag, and the Black Oil, it's 3 different stages of Scotland, isn't it? That's the kind of,
Yeah, well, there's specifically the Highlands and Islands, I suppose. The 3 different stages of kind of commercial exploitation of the land, beginning sort of with the clearances and the arrival of the sheep that the landowners put on the land instead of people, because they realized it was more profitable, and the atrocities they committed as a result. And then with the arrival of the kind of Victoriana era of shooting and what we might call Balmorality, I suppose that's the right phrase,
yeah.
isn't it? And kind of posh folk seeing the Highlands as their personal playground to run around in tweed shooting live animals. And then the oil boom of the 1960s, and the arrival of American oil companies, and the continuing, some might say, exploitation of that part of the world. The what's extraordinary about it, though, is that it's not just a straightforward drama. It's a kind of review. It's a kind of sketches and songs and comedy skits, verbatim bits, some of which are extremely serious. And it in that, formally at least, it takes its, well, no, formally and politically and kind of thematically, it takes its inspiration. 784, the company we should mention, John McGrath's famous left-wing theatre company, 784. It takes its inspiration. They took their inspiration from Glasgow Unity Theatre in the kind of not mentioned weep necessarily, but that they did a lot of other activity in trade union meetings and in work factory canteens and all sorts of kind of agitprop sketch comedy, which itself was inspired by music hall and variety, which itself was inspired by the folk traditions that the Reformed Scottish Church had been unable to suppress. So it's interesting, you can trace that line all the way through from the Reformation to the Cheviot, the Stag, and the Black Oil, and then you'll see beyond. But it's it's hilarious. It's really funny. And it's set and it was incredibly revolutionary at the same time. Other people were doing other revolutionary stuff, straightforward playwriting in the 1970s. There was a whole host of Scottish playwrights that emerged in the 1970s as well, who wrote some incredible stuff. But people remember the Cheviot, the Stag, and the Black Oil, maybe because it was filmed.
Yeah, I think so. And the careers of some of the people involved.
Yeah, well, I chatted with Bill Patterson, which was terrific because he's such a legend, and he's yeah. I didn't have to edit him down at all.
But because when you give the kind of synopsis of it, people might think, oh, this is another really dark thing, but it's not. As you say, it's hilarious. They took it round kind of small venues around the country, relevant venues to what they were talking about, and there was getting people up to dance, join in if you like, and that tradition is as you've just mentioned, is a really strong one, kind of to this day. I saw Prudentia Hart. I can't remember the full title of it.
The Strange Undoing of Prudentia Hart. Same thing.
Yeah, which was that kind of style, wasn't it?
Well, as we'll see, we'll go on Blackwatch, the National Theatre of Scotland show. It's doing something not dissimilar at all. And John Tiffany was explicitly saying that was inspired. You see it every year in Scotland. There is a production that is that follows in that tradition. I mean, it's definitely worth pointing out that they didn't invent that as a form of, it's a kind of traditional ceilidh isn't just a dance, right? It's in Gaelic culture, it's a coming together of people and stories and songs and all sorts. And they were very much, it was very astutely building on that tradition to tour their play around the Highlands based on that kind of model that did kind of already exist. And in doing that, they had a Gaelic speaker, Dalina McLennan, who's still with us, to kind of help them on their way. I mean, Bill told me that they wouldn't have even been able to eat. I mean, this is the Highlands in the 1970s. There was fuck all. Do you know what I mean, in terms of hospitality?
Yeah.
So they wouldn't have had stuff to eat unless they had Dalina speaking Gaelic, being able to knock on, families' doors, friends' doors, people she know, and get them eggs and bread and stuff so that they could make picnics, so that they could actually survive while they were touring this show.
Listening to that episode, which I did just before we spoke, it struck me as well how 784, it was a real, it wasn't just the group themselves, but the kind of folk who were orbiting around it. So you had John Byrne doing the backdrops. They had done stuff with Billy Connolly. You've got the people who would then do a play a pie and a pint, is it? I mean, that's the same
Yeah,
McClellan.
well, David McLennan was
Yeah.
no relation to Delina McLennan, just the same surname, but David and Elizabeth McLennan
Yeah.
were part of 784 as well. Yeah, and
Yeah.
they came from Glasgow, and then David went on to do a play a pie and a pint.
Yeah, so you know you had that real creative hub kind of circling around, so their influence was just fantastic. And you see, you know, what was going on in the 70s, but I think even going on into the 80s, when I was starting to go to a lot of theatre, and Wildcat was a company that was kicking about, and
Yeah,
other,
David McLennan founded that as well.
yeah, yeah, their influence really kind of kept on going. I think past
Yeah,
its
for sure.
impact. And now the one I didn't know at all is Joe Clifford's Losing Venice. So without giving any spoilers for the episode, and a purely personal point of view, what can you tell us about it? What's the story of
So
Venice?
Jo, who known as John back then, she lives in Leith now, and I went down to see her and I chatted with her for a couple of hours about the 1980s, because in the 1980s you get a whole new generation of Scottish playwrights emerging, maybe writing a more text-based form of drama, and they centre around Chavez Theatre, which was founded in '69, I think, but really came into its own in the and it was helped foster this generation of playwrights in the '70s that I mentioned earlier. But then in the 1980s, there was three playwrights in particular came to the fore in 1985, helped kind of ushered in by the directors then, Jenny Killick and Steve Unwin. And those playwrights were Peter Arnott, Chris Hannon, and Joe Clifford. And in the summer of 1985, they all three had three different plays on at the Travis at the same time. Peter Arnott had White Rose, Chris Hannon had Elizabeth Gordon Quinn, and Joe Clifford had Losing Venice. That were all massive hits, and they really kind of established the Travis as a place to be, really, in the mid 1980s. Losing Venice is about Joe's an expert in, I think she did a PhD in dramas of the Spanish Golden Age, and she had come across this story about, I'm going to get some of this wrong probably, about the Duke of Osasuna, and the poet Quevedo, who had fostered this mad scheme to they'd come up with this mad scheme to foster revolution in Venice, bring about the fall of the Doge, and then take over Venice and expand Spain's empire. And at the same time as Joe came across this story, obviously, it was the Falklands was happening, and Britain, losing its empire, was going off on another mad imperial expedition around the other side of the world. And Joe saw a parallel between these two things and wrote this kind of mad fantasia, dreamlike play, which is very funny and very political, very kind of, but very metaphorical as well at the same time. And I think it arrived at a point and it just chimed with everyone. No one knew what it was going to think, but she thought it was going to be a total disaster when it first opened, but it wasn't. And it transferred to London. And interestingly, it was revived. I have seen it, and no recording of it exists. This is the only one that doesn't have clips in it. But I did see it in London in 2018, or maybe 2017, when the director Paul Miller, who had seen it back then, revived it in the wake of the Brexit vote, because Brexit, he saw parallels in the sentiment that some people associated with Brexit, as well as this kind of mad Spanish expedition, and as well as the Falklands. Yeah, and it was about that generation of playwrights, and that play is about, so if the generation that surrounded 784 and all those interesting writers had established that you don't have to write in kind of RP English on the Scottish stage, you can write about Scottish stuff in your own voice, the plays like the Slab Boys, John Burns' The Slab Boys, then these playwrights of the 1980s were like, well, we don't even have to write about Scottish stuff. We can write about what the fuck we want from a Scottish perspective, and our ideas are as valid about this international stuff. Just because we live and work in Scotland doesn't mean we have to be restricted to writing about Scotland.
Yeah.
And that was what that was all about. It was an extraordinary kind of flowering of ambition.
I'm really looking forward to listening to that one because I've
Yeah, I mean, I would like someone to revive it sometime up here, but I don't know when you'll be able to actually see the play.
yeah.
Fingers crossed someone does.
So the next one is Stephen Greenhorn's Passing Places, which I saw at the Citizens, I think with Colin McCready in one of the roles. I'm pretty sure. So why was this included?
So, well, I know Steve, so I know he could. I knew he would agree to do an interview with me.
The practicalities of it, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I thought there's a lot of stuff happens in the 90s. Glasgow City of Culture is a big part of the
Yeah.
podcast as well. The inspiration that people got from that, and the internationalism and but one of the other things is that and you'll be able to tell me, Alistair, because I didn't experience any of this, but presumably you did, is that in the 90s, after the kind of ravages of Thatcherism and the decline of heavy industry in Scotland, there was a generation of guys and of people and women as well who came of age and didn't really have their identity handed to them on a plate, like, all right, you're going to go and spend the next 40 years working in the mines, or you're going to go work in the shipyards or wherever. And suddenly, and also at the same time, everyone thought Thatcher, the Tories would get voted out in '92, and then they weren't. And this led Steve's argument is that left the whole generation of Scots really unsure of where they were going and what they were doing and what the point was and what the point of Scotland was and what the point of them was. And that is all fed into his play, Passing Places. I mean, different playwrights react to this. David Harrower and David Gregg and Nicola McCartney being the other kind of big three playwrights that emerged in Scotland at the time. They all react to these questions in different ways. But Stephen's idea was to channel them through these two young lads from Motherwell, not far from where he's from, and send them off on a trip across Scotland, basically, on a kind of road trip. It was billed as a road movie for the stage, so they go all the way up north. I think they end up in Thurso or somewhere. And it's a comedy, but it's a comedy about these two young lads not having a clue who they are, not having a clue what Scotland is, and trying to figure that out. And it's really funny.
It is. It's very funny, and I remember it being staged. You say you've got the car front center on stage, and the two of them, like a kind of two-hander, if you like, chatting away until other people get involved. And it's interesting you talking about that, because that's when I was in my 20s in that period, and nearly everyone I knew was working in the service industry and working in restaurants and bars and all that kind of stuff. And the kind of influence of American culture was in the west coast of Scotland in particular was absolutely everywhere. So this kind of identity was something that was a complex one, to say the least. I would like to go back and read Passing Places again. I think I've got a copy of it somewhere, just to
Must be one of those books on the shelf behind you. Have you not got? There's a
I think
they started getting published around this time as well. That's worth saying, is that books of plays just started getting published, so people could actually make a living out of playwriting. Because what happens when a play gets published is that other people can then put it on, and writers can earn royalties. So in the 90s, there were these there was an infrastructure within which you could exist as a playwright, and that will get produced again, I would say. Passing Places, definitely, because it's a kind of it ticks a lot of boxes for theatres commercially.
One of my favourite books to read is John Byrne's plays, just because they're so brilliantly funny and his language is just so rich, including his television work. So you're right, that was quite a change to be able to go in and get a copy of something that you'd maybe seen the night before. So before we go into the kind of last one, I guess there will be people who have been in touch saying, why haven't you included that, and why haven't you included that, which is probably a bit of a pain. Is that the case?
Yeah, although I should say, like, I tried I at least pay lip service to almost every major Scottish play written since since 1542. So if I don't actually specifically focus on these plays, then I'll give a mention of them anyway, and a kind of very brief synopsis of them, perhaps. It's very comprehensive as a podcast, I think.
It is, it absolutely is. In fact, in the Cheviot one, you know, I'd kind of been thinking when I saw the first list, no John Byrne, who's an absolute hero of mine, as you can probably tell by the moustache. But Joyce McMillan does really kind of waxes lyrical about John Byrne in that episode.
Yeah, I don't forget about John, but sometimes I circle back to them as well. If they because John Byrne first popped up doing the stuff for the Great Northern Welly Boot Show in 72 or something like that, but it wasn't until I want to say 78 or 79 or something that actually he wrote something for the stage. So he enters briefly and then he comes back again.
Yeah. So let's go on to Gregory Burke's Black Watch, which really became a global phenomenon. And I was interested to know why you think that was, why this was the one that really traveled.
Interesting question. Did you see it?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I'd never saw it in person. God, I wish I had, because I think it's phenomenal. I saw it, the National Theatre of Scotland sent me a video link, which I think you can probably find somewhere on some kind of education portals to watch. And I would highly recommend it because it is terrific. Why? Well, it was one of the first things that the National Theatre of Scotland did. It was extremely, and it was in the wake of the Iraq War. It's about, we should say, if you haven't seen it, it's about the Black Watch, the regiment, and the history of the Black Watch regiment. But specifically, it's about the regiment in Iraq, kind of Camp Dogwood, I think, in the early 2000s, just at the time as the regiment was being absorbed into a kind of super regiment, and maybe its identity was being lost to an extent. So it was politically extremely sensitive and internationally sensitive as well, because the Iraq War was a global issue. It was also about the founding of the National Theatre of Scotland, so there was a huge kind of interest and energy in their work at the time. And it had John Tiffany directing it, I would say, who directed Passing Places, directed the first version of Passing Places as well, the one with Colin McCready that you saw, and had grown up. Well, he's from Yorkshire originally, but had gone to Glasgow in around 1990, so had seen this extraordinary stuff when Glasgow was City of Culture in 1990, and had seen 784 stuff. I don't think he'd seen any of it, but he had. No, he probably did. But he'd certainly seen the Cheviot on video, and he had this idea of making a play that was inspired by that tradition of Scottish theatre that involved song and involved movement and direct address. And if you see Black Watch, you can see all of it. It has all of this in it. It has some of the most, it has some incredibly moving songs in it. It has some really funny bits of like banter between the soldiers on the ground in Iraq, and it has this really one of the most extraordinary theatrical things I've ever seen, where the main character, what's his name, Brian Ferguson, the actor that originated the kind of lead role of Cammy, he was walking. All of it was inspired, I should say. Greg Burke, the playwright that wrote it, he was inspired by interviews he'd actually done with soldiers from Fife who were in the Black Watch, and it has this extraordinary scene where Cammy is walking from end to end of the theatre. It's done in a kind of traverse staging, telling the history of the regiment from the kind of from like the Culloden onwards, and every time he gets to the one end of the theatre, the rest of the cast surround him and change his uniform and tip him up and upside down and button up his jacket and put a new hat on, so that his costume evolves from the kind of Highland dress that it was through the kind of 1800s and then the First World War, then the Second World War, and he ends up in the kind of combat fatigues, the desert fatigues of the kind of modern day regiment, as he simultaneously is telling the story of the regiment, and it is breathtakingly accomplished. It's a piece of theatre. It is world class. I mean, John Tiffany went on to do all sorts of extraordinary things, the Harry Potter play being the most famous example, but right there you can see that is a director that is the Premier League of kind of theatre directors worldwide. It's an extraordinary achievement, and it's only 90 minutes long. And the story itself, this kind of it's about just these young lads from Fife who lose themselves in the desert in Iraq, but it's also about Scotland and the history and the warfare and politics and kind of why the army is so appealing to young people, and
Yeah.
the industrialization, it's and military folly as well, that which ties in with losing Venice as well. I only just thought of that now. It's an incredible piece of work.
It really is. And if my memory is right, the way that they'd staged it when I went to see it anyway, it was the seating were on the two sides. So when you have Cammy, I totally agree with what you said about what it is like to witness. It's extra impact because you're just not all watching this take place in front of you. You're actually almost on top of it, and how this is kind of changing as it goes along.
Yeah, I mean, it makes it incredibly flexible as well for touring as well. So they did that in the drill hall on Forest Road, just in Old Town originally in the summer of 2006, the festival of 2006. And you're right, it's toured Scotland multiple times, it toured the world multiple times. And because it was basically just two banks of seating and an open space, they could do it anywhere. And that was part of its appeal. There's an interesting conversation around Blackwatch as to why it was so successful internationally. Obviously, the fact that it is about the Blackwatch must have had an appeal, because the Blackwatch has a kind of international reputation, particularly in America, I would say, and Canada as well. I think that Canada even has a Blackwatch in the same way. But it's not, people have accused it of kind of glorifying the Blackwatch, which I do not think it does at all. If you watch it, it's very clear-eyed and it's very critical at times of the regiment, but it just has sympathy with the young lads that are in it. And yeah, so while it might have traded on that kind of, I'm trying to pick my words carefully here, but traded internationally on that image of Scotland as the kind of place of tartan and the Blackwatch and this famous regiment that wore kilts and all that stuff. As a play, it succeeds. That might have got it in the door, but as a play, it succeeds because it's a brilliant piece of drama.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, it is, there's so much going on from the beginning, but that kind of telling of history is, I can see why that would be of interest to people. I think you said at the beginning as well, it's not heavily text based, it's performative, which means it would be able to kind of travel.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's got songs in it as well. The songs are wonderful.
Yeah,
Brilliant.
absolutely.
And it's hilarious. That's the other thing to say. It's really funny as well at the same time.
I think I'm right in saying it was released on DVD. I'm sure I did a kind of film group when I was at university on a Friday afternoon, and that was something that we showed. So it must have been available somewhere.
It will be that. It was. I think it was broadcast on the BBC as well, which they probably turned into a DVD. You'll be able to get that somewhere. Maybe it's on Amazon. I think it probably is actually.
Yeah, I guess it probably is. And I didn't realize there's a 7th episode to come after the 6 plays. A kind of live one, if you like. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, we recorded it at the Travis 3 weeks ago now, and the episode 6 stops in kind of 2014 on the eve of the referendum, but there's been 10 years of drama since then, and there will be hopefully many more years of drama to come. So myself, the artistic director of the Travis Theatre, Gareth Nichols, the critic Mark Fisher, who features in the podcast a lot, and the playwrights Nicola McCartney and Isla Cowan, we did a kind of panel discussion at the Travis Theatre, which quite a few people came along to, which was nice. And we chatted about all of this. Each of the panelists picked a play that they thought was significant of the last 10 years. We talked about the current state of Scottish theatre, which is pretty bleak, principally due to the lack of state support. That's another theme throughout the entire podcast, by the way, is that perhaps because Scotland is quite small, doesn't have a massive audience compared to, say, London of theatre, it's very hard for a commercial theatre to survive up here. So theatre has always been subsidised, drama has always been subsidised, and the plays that I've mentioned in this podcast broadly, apart from Men Should Weep maybe, but that was amateur, exist because of state subsidy. And so we in the live discussion we discussed that and the kind of lack of state subsidy at the moment, and the fuck-ups that Creative Scotland has made. And then we talk about what might happen in the future, what playwrights want to write about and how that can be facilitated. And it was a really lively discussion. It was quite passionate at times. I'm quite excited for it to go out.
I'm looking forward to listening to that one and the 3 I haven't heard already.
I should have sent you. Should have asked me, Alistair. I could have sent you them.
No, I want to experience them as other people
Thank
would.
you.
I'm quite happy to do that. Fergus, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. It's been absolutely fascinating. As I say, I was really looking forward to talking to you about these plays, because I do agree with you that Scottish drama isn't discussed enough, and there's some really important pieces there.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it was my pleasure. Thanks very much.
And we'll be back soon with someone completely different.